investigative. This is KXAN News at 11.
Welcome back, everybody. With heated primaries and a critical midterm election taking center stage in 2026, Texas voters remain concerned about high prices and specifically the high cost of health care.
That's all according to a new polling released today from the University of Texas and the Texas Politics Project. All right, so get this. It shows 67% of voters reported being very concerned about the cost of health care, topping the list of a dozen other economic concerns. Now, the release of this poll coincides with a vote on Capitol Hill to try and extend those recently expired health insurance subsidies created by the Affordable Care Act and, of course, impacting millions of Americans.
Now, when asked about the most important problem facing the country today, inflation and higher prices, was actually beat out by just one issue. That was political corruption and leadership. And so that's where we want to start today with Joshua Blank, the research director of the Texas Politics Project. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm sure the day after or the day that one of these comes out, you're exhausted. There's a lot in this poll.
That's true.
So thanks for joining us to help us, parse through some of it.
Sure.
That overarching question about the most important problem that the country is facing, we actually saw similar results when asked about the same for the state of Texas, with the answer being political corruption. What does that indicate to you about how voters are feeling, and what impact might that have on some critical March primaries that are just around the corner?
Well, the challenge really here, and especially in a state like Texas, where Republicans maintain control over all levers of government, and currently right now over all levers of the federal government, what you're seeing is that Democrats are really driving those results. Democrats are focused on leadership, whether at the state level or, of course, Donald Trump at the national level. But it's also the case that independents are focused on this issue, too. They're concerned about the direction of the country. They're concerned about the direction of the state. And while Republicans may be much happier with those aspects of where things are going, the other thing that's happened in the context of the first year of the Trump presidency is that Republican focus on immigration, the border, which generally is way out front, especially here in Texas, has really evaporated. And what that's done is created this vacuum where this real huge amount of attention among, again, especially Democrats and independents on the leadership is just taking center stage.
And we want to talk a little bit more about those primaries. This poll asking voters how they feel about candidates in many of those races, including governor, U.S. Senate seat. So let's talk about why would you ask about favorability versus maybe asking people who they plan to vote for?
Yeah, I mean, the main reason that we do this is because of the fact that for the most part, voters aren't tuned into this race yet, or any of these races actually. And when we ask voters consistently how much attention they're paying to the 2026 elections, to the upcoming primaries, we find very few voters are actually really paying attention to this. So when we ask sort of this, let's say a trial ballot question, we say, here's a list of 5 candidates to choose from, we know from experience that most of the voters who are going to be responding to that poll, one, are not going to participate in the primary. And number 2, 4 out of 5 of them probably don't even know who most of those candidates are. So it can lead to a misleading picture where the most known candidate automatically seems to have an advantage.
Sure.
So what we like to do is put everybody on the same scale. So some people are in office, we could ask job approval numbers, but some people aren't. So by asking about whether you have favorable or unfavorable views of them, not only do we get to dig into sort of the relative strength that these candidates have overall, but also within key segments of the electorate that they're going to need to convince in order to be successful in the primary.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So the poll really asked some interesting questions about 2 topics that are now, just today and this week, dominating the headlines. One of those has to do with foreign relations, and the other had to do with a series of questions about how the United States is handling immigration enforcement. We know Texans were split about whether they feel, and I'll quote the question, if the country would be better off if we just stayed home and did not concern ourselves with problems in other parts of the world. And we'll note for our viewers that 45% of Texans agreed, 48% disagreed, so we're seeing a split there. We'll reiterate for people, this poll was conducted prior to news about the United States strike on Venezuela and bringing its president back here to the country to face charges.
And is any surprise there with that? Is that something that, you listen to that and then given especially what's happened?
Well, I mean, the thing that's interesting about this particular question in response to this item is that we've been seeing a real development over time in terms of attitudes towards just foreign involvement by the U.S. And what we generally see is that Democratic voters tend to be more open to foreign involvement. That doesn't necessarily mean military involvement, but more involvement in foreign affairs. Republicans, on the other hand, for a number of years have really been moving more towards withdrawing from foreign affairs. And one of the interesting things I think about where we are right now, among many things, is that while the president's efforts in the foreign domain are not uncommon for a second-term president, oftentimes this is something that presidents do, if not in this fashion, it is running headlong into the challenge of the fact that Republicans themselves are very split on how involved the U.S. should be in foreign affairs at all. And that's something that I think we're going to have to kind of see play out a little bit more over time as we seem to be taking a much, much more active and interventionist role, which really the party in power, at least its voters, are not necessarily on board with.
In that same vein, and I want to see if we can pull back up, I know we got ahead of ourselves a little bit here, the numbers that were in response to voters' feelings about enforcement of federal immigration laws, because I think it reflects a bit of what you were just talking about with foreign policy. We'll note that 45% of respondents said they believe the federal government, the Trump administration, had gone too far when it came to immigration enforcement. 25% say they feel it's about right. 23% of voters say they've not gone far enough.
Right.
Of course, this week, so many debates and protests we're seeing regarding the death of a woman shot by an ICE agent in Minnesota. Also, recent news of 2 more shot by a Border Patrol agent in Portland. So we'll reiterate for folks, you asked this question weeks ago prior to some of this turmoil. But what do you think the results say about now, what is the main issue on many Americans' minds?
Yeah, I mean, I think you raise an important point, which is we did ask this question before the actions of the last few weeks. But we also asked this question back during the first Trump administration term, and one of the things to note is that the share of Texans who think the administration has gone too far has increased. But what's also really important to understand here is about 4 in 5 Republicans, a little more than 80%, think the administration has either gone about far enough or not far enough. And so within the majority party, there's so far no backlash to these efforts. Now, I think that we're going to see in the coming days and weeks when new polling comes out, whether in Texas or elsewhere, is whether we're starting to see some shifts in those attitudes. And I think we should expect to, because what we do find is as much as we do see extreme support for immigration enforcement, it matters where it is and it matters how it's done and it matters who. And these are going to be raising issues where the idea of immigration enforcement is this distant thing that's taking place on the border, and it starts to be spilling over into American cities and streets. That is likely to change people's opinions and attitudes.
Josh, we just have truly a couple seconds left with you.
Yeah, sure.
There's so much to discuss, but I do want to ask about some of those key affordability, high cost, whether that's healthcare or inflation, any big takeaways that people should know about how voters are feeling there.
Yeah. Healthcare really jumped out in this poll, and it wasn't just the 67% of voters who said they were very concerned, which is now outpacing prices, which had been the top concern. But it was also the case that a near majority disapproved of the president's handling of the issue. And in fact, when we asked about 12 different areas in which the state legislature and leaders have acted over the last year, healthcare was at the bottom. Only 22% of Texans approved of the job legislature had done, a majority disapproved. And going into an election year, this is something that everybody should be paying attention to.
Absolutely.
Fantastic,
All right.
yeah.
Well, we just skimmed the surface here.
I know.
Yeah, very much so. We've got all details on KXAN.com if you want to check it out. Josh, thanks for joining us this afternoon.